Hi, everybody. So, I'm going to tell you why I love programming in Xamarin. I do not work for Microsoft. I have no shares in Microsoft. There is no hidden agenda here. I'm just an indie developer. I have quite a long commute every day. I live in Switzerland, and I have about an hour and a half every day on the train, which in some ways is terrible. I get up at 4:30, go for a run, get on a bus at 5:40. But the nice side of it is that it gives me an hour and a half of pure software development bliss. And there's something about being on a train that really works for me. I'm not sure what it is, but I guess I really focus, and I can look out of the window, and the scenery is always changing, so I love it. I love developing on the train. And the question is, what do I do? I'm not going to kind of do my day job work. No way. I want to do my own projects. So a few years ago, I got an Amazon Echo. It wasn't actually this one. It was the Tube, and I put it in the kitchen. And what normally happens when Damian introduces technology into the house is that the house rebels. No way, we don't want that. You know, it's terrible. It wasn't the case with the Amazon Echo. My family started using it for adding things to the shopping list, playing the radio, playing music, setting timers, home control. So it really worked well. A little bit too well. So that's actually not all of them. I remembered there was another one that said these are all the Amazon Echoes sitting around in my house. So on my train journey every day, I was thinking, what can I do with the Amazon Echo? So the first thing I did was created a little skill. And so these skills are kind of extensions to the Amazon Echo, so that I could say, Alexa, tell my notebook the wine I like is called Zinfandel, and it would save a note to Evernote or to OneNote, depending on how you had it configured. And that was kind of fun. But the next level down was home control. I created some home control skills to let me control Z-Wave devices that I'd bought in 2005, 2006, and never done anything with. All my switches were these home control, but I never did anything with them until now, when I actually extended, by programming using the skill mechanism from Amazon, I was able to home control all these switches. But it goes further, much, much further, because Amazon allow you as a developer to create your own devices that expose the Amazon Echo functionality, the Alexa functionality. There's a set of API calls that you can implement. It's mainly made for device manufacturers, but you can also use it from an app. So they have a whole set of documentation, and it's quite complicated. There's a whole set of interfaces you have to implement. But this seemed really interesting to me. Why couldn't I do that on my phone, for example, and create an Alexa that runs on my phone? Now, there are some pretty stringent requirements about what you have to do. You have to use HTTP2, not HTTP1, because they establish a down channel and send messages down to you, to your app, asynchronously, using HTTP push. They also require that you open the microphone and stream audio up to the server, so that it can then detect silence and send a message back saying stop recording. So on iOS, that can get a little bit tricky with the audio engine tapping, installing taps, sending the samples up over the network. I got it working on the iPhone one day on the train, and that was kind of nice, but there are apps that do that already. So I went a step further, because what I really wanted was it running on my Apple Watch. And I got that working on the Apple Watch. And last week, I released it to the App Store, and it got quite popular on Reddit, and it's doing quite well. Now, you're probably thinking, okay, great, Damian, fantastic, you did an Apple Watch app, and the Amazon Echo is great. When are you going to start talking about Xamarin? Well, this is Xamarin. This was written using Xamarin. The key thing that I want to tell you, the message you should leave with, is Xamarin apps are native applications. You use the native APIs. So when you're developing using CSharp, you have a whole set of class libraries that are available to you as a CSharp developer using .NET, collections, stuff for doing files, databases, and so on. But if you're building an iOS app, you use the iOS APIs. You're creating a native application. Even though you're using the CSharp development environment to develop, it's actually using the Xcode toolchain behind the scenes to create a native iOS app or WatchOS app. And the same goes for Android. It's a completely native application. Now, CSharp is really a lot of fun to develop with. I'm not going to go into all the things that are fun and that I really enjoy about it, but I just want to touch on one thing. No matter what platform you're using, whether it's Android or iOS or whatever, there's one key message, which is you do not mess around with the UI thread. You do not block the UI thread. It's the first thing you learn, I guess, when you're mobile programming. So you have to put everything that kind of does a lot of CPU or does I/O, you push off the UI thread. And just one of many features that I love about C# is async await, which was introduced in 2012, 2013. And what it lets you do is create asynchronous code that runs off the UI thread. If you see there's an await call in the main body there, what that does is that all the code that's after that is packaged up by the compiler and called when that asynchronous method, the file.open, in this case here, finishes, and it calls it back on the context, the original calling context, on the original calling thread, although that is configurable. So it turns callback hell into beautiful kind of imperative code, and it handles things like exceptions. And this is really tricky. What the compiler does behind the scenes is actually generates a state machine. There's a lot more to C#. We had reactive extensions in 2009. There's the language integrated query. There's a lot of stuff that makes it a lot of fun to program with. But if I go back to my Alexa on the Apple Watch app, you can see this is my Visual Studio solution, which consists of a set of different projects. So I have I don't know, 4 or 5 projects there. If I look at what I did was I wanted to share as much code as I could between the iOS app and the Watch app, just as you'd do if you were developing in Swift. So if we expand out that Apple shared code, then you can see that in there we've got all the standard code that's kind of platform specific that I can share between the WatchOS app and the iOS app. And it's surprising, I was delighted how much code I could share, including all the tricky audio engine stuff. That just worked. I could share it between the two of them. So it kind of made sense to share that code. I also, just to kind of show you the extension there, if you've developed WatchOS apps in the past, you'll see that it's just the same as with Swift. We have extension delegate, we have interface controllers, we have all the usual stuff that you'd expect. But what about this one here, this top one here? This is my Amazon voice service implementation, my engine. And that has all the code that talks to the Amazon voice service. This is where 90% of the code is sitting in there. It's the one that's handling the HTTP multi-part requests. What happens if the users sets an alarm, set a 5-second pizza timer, then start playing my daily flash briefing, and then the alarm comes in, and the user says stop. There's a whole set of standards defined by Amazon, exactly how it should behave. And that code is quite tricky, and it's all in there. So that code is actually what in .NET terms is a standard library, a NetStandard library. And it actually generates a binary. And that binary can be used, obviously, on iOS, and obviously, so therefore, on the Mac. As you've seen, it can be used on the Apple Watch. But NetStandard is also supported on the Mac. So I can, using .NET, I can reuse that application, or that DLL, that Amazon Voice Service implementation on Mac, on Apple TV. I was so excited. Apple TV, I know it's got a microphone. I could bring Alexa to the Apple TV. No, it's not exposed to the developer. So my particular NetStandard library there is of no use as it currently stands on the Apple TV. But the point is you can share that NetStandard library and all the code across Windows, Android, Wear OS. AWS Lambdas can use those NetStandard libraries. Unity. So I have a dream. I have no idea if I'm going to make it real, which is to put on my VR headset and have a virtual Alexa or an AR and have a virtual Alexa sitting there using that library. And I've done 90% of the code. So maybe I'll do that one day. So when I published this app or and put it on Reddit, somebody said, well, what about running it on my Samsung Gear watch? Ha ha ha. And the reality is that Samsung are going with Microsoft.NET for Tizen 4. So you can't do it right now. But on the future Samsung watches and Samsung TVs, there's no reason why I shouldn't be able to take my Alexa implementation and run it there as well. So far I've talked about shared code. What about shared user interface? There is something called Xamarin Forms. You do not have to use Xamarin Forms. You can go native all the way, share as much business logic as you can, but there is something called Xamarin Forms, which what Xamarin have done is basically, there's a set of UI components that are on every single platform, buttons, labels, daytime pickers, those kinds of things. And they've taken all of those and created a model view model mechanism where you can define an interface using XML, and then you can share that interface across Windows, Mac, iOS, Android. I'm conflicted about Xamarin Forms because it can create a very samey user interface. It's not, if I was you and I was creating an app specifically for commercial use, I would probably not go with Xamarin Forms. But if you're building an app for inside a company, for example, and you want it to run on Android and iOS and Windows and Mac, this may make sense. And in my case, I've got a minimal user interface. It's really about voice. It's not about the user interface. So there is some UI stuff. You know, you can say, how big is Switzerland, or who is Thomas Edison, or what's the weather? And this is my app running, and that's using Xamarin Forms. So for the iOS app, I used Xamarin Forms to create the user interface. Now, also on the iOS app, I had to use a component that that Amazon provide called Login with Amazon. It's a framework you can download, and I had to use that. So I made a bridge to the native framework, to this Amazon framework that I could call from .NET. So it's relatively straightforward. I'm not going to say it's not just point and click. There was some work involved in accessing this existing framework, but you can access existing code. You can reuse existing code. Of course, most of the time you're not going to want to. If you want to access the I don't know, compass or sensors, various different sensors, there are plugins that exist that you can use and that work across all the different platforms. So I also, in my solution, now have an Apple Mac, and there was almost no code to write for the Apple Mac version because I could reuse the Xamarin Forms, I could reuse the Apple Shared, because all that audio code that I wrote, not only did it work on iOS and on the watch, it also worked on the Mac. I was absolutely so happy. I've also got it running on Android now, and Android Wear. So there's a whole set of platforms that I get not for free, and I'm not going, when I had to write the code to fetch, to stream audio on Android, it wasn't as hard as iOS, but it wasn't nothing either. So there is still work, it's not painless, but I can reuse all that logic I wrote for talking to the Amazon voice service and the UI if I want to. It's also, interestingly enough, open source. So the compiler is called Roslyn, open source, and extendable, and you can plug into it. And there are a lot of refactoring engines that use the CSharp open source. Everything else is pretty much open source. It's all on GitHub. I wasn't putting this slide together last night. If you see something about Satya or Microsoft acquiring GitHub, that's just an illusion. That's a figment of your imagination. So anyway, it's all open source. You'll find it all there, and they're accepting contributions. If you want to get started, you can download and use Visual Studio for iOS and for Mac for free. If you're an indie developer like me, you can use it for free. And it's not heavy. This is my MacBook Adorable, my MacBook One. And I developed that app on that laptop. So it doesn't require massive resources. I have got it maxed out with 16 gig of memory. There's also JetBrains provide a Rider, which also works on, as well as Windows and Mac. It also runs on Linux. There's an IDE that runs on iOS that you can use as well. So the reason I love programming using Xamarin is that it lets me use a programming language that I really, really like. It lets me reuse as much code as I want to. Code that I've tested. There's a bug right now in the app. Amazon have an option where you can, in your Alexa, you can tell it after you've asked a question to keep the microphone open for 5 seconds to let the user ask a follow-up question. It's not working right now in my application. But I know that if I fix it once in that shared library, all the other platforms will get that for free because I'm sharing that code, and it's a binary that I'm sharing between all those different platforms. So this is why I really like programming in using Xamarin. 5 years ago, I was a Microsoft developer, and I was kind of despairing because Microsoft seemed all about protecting the cash cow, protecting Windows and Office, and it really sucked. And I'm so happy at how Microsoft have changed over the last 5 years under Satya Nadella. They acquired Xamarin, and with Miguel de Casa and Nat Friedman, I have no concerns about their acquisition of GitHub because they're going to be putting Nat Friedman, who headed up Xamarin, in charge of GitHub. So I'm really happy with the way things are going right now, their embrace of open source. So my name's Damian Mehers. You'll find me on Twitter, Damian Mehers, or Damian.fr.